Good day, I'm Andrew McKink from the University of Johannesburg's Department of Emergency Medical Care. Simulation-based learning is such an exciting area of education, and we're really only starting to scratch the surface of the future of teaching, learning and assessment. I think as educators, we face the challenge of trying to merge what has always been done with what could be done going into the future. If you always do what you always did, you will almost always get what you always got. If what you always got is considered okay, then sometimes there is a view that, well, okay is okay, and that is okay. The question I pose is whether or not okay is ever really okay. As we navigate the quagmire of education in a rapidly changing world, it is sometimes difficult to move out of our comfort zones. New things take time, resources, and sometimes quite a thick skin. Within medical education, most people are well versed in the OSCE, or Objective Structured Clinical Examination. Did you ever wonder how OSCEs came about and how they are now an integral part of healthcare and other education? The OSCE was the brainchild of R.M. Harden, who wrote about the concept in his article, What is an OSCE? In Medical Teacher, published in 1988. The OSCE was born out of a perceived need to do things better. Like many other things in education, the SAT lab was no different. Think back to when you were a student. Students are really good at spotting the problems with even the most minuscule issue in even the most insignificant test. The missing full stop, that misplaced capital letter, and I was no different. Once I moved into the academic domain, I gave my student years a long, hard look and realized I could change things, but I probably lacked confidence. Sometimes, as humans, we undersell our own ideas. I thought about JFK's 1962 visit to the NASA Space Center. He was walking down a corridor and met a janitor. When he asked the janitor what he did at NASA, the janitor replied, I'm helping put a man on the moon. Perhaps this is what galvanized me to start changing my mindset from I was thinking to I need to. This is probably where SATLab had its beginnings. I reflected about what irritated me the most about simulations and wondered how this could be rectified. I have always found it interesting to be on the other side of the table. And now that I am, I have realized that, like the Lorax from Dr. Seuss says, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. And so the simulation assessment tool limiting assessor bias, or SATLab, was developed. The primary aims to address some of the perceived challenges related to simulation assessment. Very briefly, the following were considered. The potential for marker bias and resultant inter-rater reliability issues. A perception that the focus was on negative feedback without adequate reference. Disparities between what the assessor wanted marked and what the marker actually marked. Lack of specificity as to how global rating scores were awarded. And a lack of specific feedback linked to how to improve performance. There are two specific components of a simulation, reliability and validity. On the one hand, we have reliability, and on the other, validity. And we try to bring the two together in a way that gives a high level of trust in whatever we are going to do or assess. In simple terms, reliability talks to how accurately the results that markers produce are a true and accurate reflection of the student's performance. And validity talks to how well the assessment tool measures what it's set out to measure. Validity also talks to how we ultimately use the results to make judgment calls related to concepts like student competence. When there are high levels of both, we are usually comfortable to trust the results. But when one or both fall short, not so much so. Without getting into too much detail related to reliability and validity, the challenge is that as much as they are technically mutually exclusive, they are also interdependent, and this gives rise to the need to get the best of both worlds. We want results that are as reliable as possible using a tool that is as valid as possible. The SATLab seeks to achieve these two aims, but at the same time recognizes that the student's learning is paramount within the assessment process, and that assessment is not simply a mark-generating activity, but rather that assessment is an integral component of the teaching and learning process. The first step is to design a simulation that is realistic and has strong links to real life, and this often incorporates the determination of the competency outcome descriptors. Prior to assessment, SATLab seeks to standardize practical competencies. It is pointless for a student to have no reference framework from which to draw their perceptions of what constitutes competency. For all too long, we have assumed that when it comes to practical skills and clinical skill sets, that students learn in a relatively standardized way from a multitude of practitioners who may or may not be teaching them correctly. SATLab does this by producing a set of what we like to call competency outcome descriptors, or CODs. These are set by the facilitator, and the aim is for them to describe a set of competency measures that students can use in their quest towards competence. Often, the simulation and the competency outcome descriptors are developed simultaneously to ensure congruence. Factors like mannequin, environmental, and patient fidelity need to be carefully considered. In short, how real is this scenario and how achievable are the outcomes? There is not necessarily a magic number of competency outcome descriptors, but there is a balance between being overly generic and overly specific, and this is often facilitator or patient dependent. Let's say, for example, that our patient had been in a motor vehicle accident and had fractured their leg. We may include the following as competency outcome descriptors: patient safety, patient communication, history taking, clinical assessment or evaluation, patient management, analgesia administration, and splinting. It is important that the competency outcome descriptors describe competencies from a practically applicable and achievable perspective, and are specific enough to guide students towards what to actually do, but are also generic enough to cater for the fact that there is not necessarily only one very specific way of doing things. The competency outcome descriptors seek to break the simulation or clinical management of a patient into bite-sized chunks of smaller competencies that make up the bigger whole of a patient interaction. Whether in the simulation environment or out in the real world, there are several components of any patient interaction. Some are generic and some are patient-specific, and SATLab seeks to provide competency outcome descriptors for each of these, obviously within reason and practicality. The competency outcome descriptors are categorized according to a 6-point rubric type scale, with perfect competency at one end and significant harm at the other. You will note that there is a marked link to each competency level, which is critical in the assessment domain. A simple example is the administration of analgesia. As you can see, the specific analgesic agent has not been specified, but the principles of analgesia administration are encapsulated within the competency outcome descriptor rubric. If we look at the best practice descriptor, you can see that it includes pretty much all of the components of what we would classify as the perfect process for administering analgesia. Bearing in mind that a patient receiving analgesia is likely to have something wrong with them, so there would be a process of assessment and diagnosis prior to analgesia administration. Once the sim is set and the competency outcome descriptors are complete, both are sent to a panel of experts. These experts are selected on criteria such as their educational and clinical experience, currency, and knowledge. Familiarity with SATLab is an added advantage. These experts review the simulation and its associated competency outcome descriptors in a pre-assessment moderation process to ensure that prior to the assessment being conducted, that it has been adequately scrutinized. Any comments are then sent back to the assessor. The expert panel are also responsible for determining the weightings of each competency outcome descriptor, where the total for the simulation is 100%, and each competency outcome descriptor contributes a percentage that links to its importance within the patient being managed. A simple example would be an asthmatic patient, where management of the asthma would be heavily weighted, and scene safety not so much so. This is an expert-specific activity and is done independently. Each expert panel member weightings are equally important, and the mean of each competency outcome descriptor's weightings are used in the final calculation. The simulation is then conducted within the relevant environment using principles of good simulation practice. Prior to the simulation, a briefing session is held with the markers to ensure that they are familiar with the competency outcome descriptors. Any queries are addressed during this session. This includes clarifying potential actions on the part of a student that may not have been considered by the assessor or the expert panel. The markers score each student using the competency outcome descriptors, and where a result is unsatisfactory, are required to provide reasons. These motivations serve to help clarify where student performance was lacking, but are also used to provide student feedback. The results are calculated using the weightings and marks awarded by the markers. Where discrepancies exist, the competency outcome descriptor specific differences can be better understood by consulting the comments as well as reviewing the video and focusing on that specific outcome. Students are then provided with relevant feedback in the form of a document that details their competency levels for each competency outcome descriptor, as well as the final marks. It is also important to make sure that students understand the competency outcome descriptors so that they are able to apply improvement strategies in each of the identified domains. To date, the feedback and results are encouraging, and SATLab is enjoying increased traction in the emergency medical care domain. The principles underlying SATLab may be applicable to other areas of healthcare assessment where simulation is used as a competency measure. Whilst no tool is perfect, SATLab appears to be a solution to many of the issues that have traditionally plagued simulation assessment. Try it. You may actually like it.